The morning mist clung to the Yorkshire moors like a shroud, and Lady Evangeline Ashford pressed her face against the cold glass of her bedroom window, watching it roll across the heather-covered hills. Today was her wedding day, a day that had been predetermined since her birth 20 years ago, when her father, the Earl of Ashford, had sealed a pact with his dearest friend, the Duke of Ravenshollow. "Miss Evangeline," came the gentle voice of her lady's maid, Sarah, from behind her. "Your mother wishes to see you before the preparations begin." Evangeline turned from the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She was considered a beauty by society's standards. Golden hair that caught the light like spun silk, eyes the color of forget-me-nots, and a figure that filled out her gowns in all the fashionable ways. Yet she felt as insubstantial as the morning mist, as if she were already fading away before her life had truly begun. "Tell my mother I shall be along presently," she said, smoothing the wrinkles from her morning dress. The Ashford estate had been buzzing with activity for weeks. Servants scurried through the halls with armfuls of white roses and ivy, while the kitchen maids worked tirelessly to prepare the wedding breakfast. The ancient chapel on the grounds had been scrubbed until its stone walls gleamed, and every piece of silver in the house had been polished to mirror brightness. Yet despite all this preparation, Evangeline felt like a stranger in her own home. She made her way through the familiar corridors, past portraits of long-dead Ashfords whose eyes seemed to follow her progress with disapproval. The weight of their expectations, of centuries of duty and obligation, pressed down upon her shoulders like a lead cloak. How many of these women had walked these same halls on their wedding mornings, carrying the same burden of an arranged marriage? Lady Victoria Ashford, Countess of Ashford, was waiting in the morning-room when Evangeline arrived. At 42, Victoria retained much of the beauty that had once made her the toast of London society. Her dark hair, only lightly touched with silver, was arranged in an elegant chignon, and her deep brown eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from experience, both joyful and sorrowful. "My dearest girl," Victoria said, rising from her chair beside the fireplace. "Come, sit with me." Evangeline settled beside her mother on the silk-upholstered settee, noting how Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from the delicate Sèvres service. Her mother had been a widow for 3 years now, since the Earl's untimely death from a riding accident, and the grief had carved new lines around her eyes and mouth. "I know this day feels overwhelming," Victoria began, her voice gentle but firm. "When I married your father, I was terrified. I barely knew him, and the thought of leaving my family home to become mistress of Ashford Hall seemed impossible." "But you grew to love him," Evangeline said, having heard this story before. "I did, eventually. Love grew slowly between us, like ivy on stone. It was not the passionate romance of novels, but it was real and steadfast." Victoria paused, her gaze distant. "The Duke of Ravenshollow is a good man, Evangeline. I have known him since we were children, long before he inherited his title. He will be kind to you." Evangeline set down her teacup with a soft clink. "Mamma, have you ever wondered what would have happened if you had been free to choose your own path? If you had not been bound by duty and expectation?" A shadow passed over Victoria's face, so quickly that Evangeline almost missed it. "Such thoughts are dangerous, my dear. They lead only to unhappiness. We are born to our stations in life, and we must find contentment within them." Yet even as her mother spoke these conventional words, Evangeline sensed something deeper beneath the surface, a yearning that Victoria had learned to suppress but never quite extinguished. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the entrance hall. Masculine voices echoed through the house, followed by the sound of boots on marble. The Duke of Ravenshollow had arrived with his entourage for the ceremony. "He is early," Victoria murmured, rising to smooth her skirts. "We must finish your preparations quickly." As they hurried toward the stairs, Evangeline caught a glimpse of the Duke through the drawing-room doorway. Sebastian Blackwood, the 5th Duke of Ravenshollow, was 35 years old and possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that commanded respect rather than admiration. His dark hair was impeccably groomed, his bearing rigid with aristocratic breeding, and his grey eyes held the cool distance of a man who had learned early to guard his emotions. He was speaking with the vicar when his gaze met Evangeline's through the doorway. For a moment their eyes held, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Was it regret? Resignation? Before she could interpret it, he bowed formally in her direction, and she hurried up the stairs after her mother. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah laced Evangeline into her wedding gown, a confection of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had cost more than many families earned in a year. The gown had been made by London's finest modiste, with a bodice that showcased her narrow waist and a train that would trail behind her like seafoam. The Ashford diamonds sparkled at her throat and ears, family heirlooms that had adorned countless Ashford brides. Yet as Sarah arranged the cathedral veil over Evangeline's carefully coiffed hair, she felt more like she was being prepared for burial than marriage. The young woman looking back at her from the mirror seemed pale and ethereal, a beautiful ghost haunting her own life. "You look like an angel," Sarah whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. Evangeline wanted to respond that angels were not bound by earthly contracts, but she merely smiled and thanked the faithful servant who had cared for her since childhood. A soft knock at the door announced her mother's arrival. Victoria entered the room and stopped short, her hand flying to her throat. "Oh, my darling," she breathed. "You are radiant." But when Victoria moved closer, Evangeline could see that her mother's eyes were bright with unshed tears. There was something else in her expression, too, a haunted quality that spoke of old sorrows and buried dreams. "Mamma, are you quite well?" Evangeline asked, concerned by her mother's pallor. "Of course, dearest. It is merely the emotion of the day." Victoria reached out to adjust a fold in the veil with shaking fingers. Every mother feels this way when her daughter marries. Yet Evangeline sensed there was more to her mother's distress than maternal sentiment. Victoria seemed almost frightened, as if she were sending her daughter into battle rather than to the altar. The sound of the chapel bells began to ring across the grounds, their bronze voices calling the guests to witness the ceremony that would bind two great families together. Evangeline knew that beyond the windows of her bedroom, carriages were arriving from across Yorkshire and beyond. The cream of society had come to witness her marriage to one of England's most eligible bachelors. "It is time," Victoria said, though her voice was barely above a whisper. As they prepared to leave the room, Evangeline turned back for one last look at her reflection. The young woman in the mirror was beautiful, poised, and perfectly dressed for her role as a duchess. Yet behind the facade, Evangeline felt hollow, as if her true self was already beginning to fade away. They descended the grand staircase together, Victoria's hand resting lightly on Evangeline's arm. The house was now filled with guests, ladies in their finest gowns of silk and velvet, gentlemen in formal morning dress, all chattering with the excitement that surrounded fashionable weddings. Yet as they moved through the crowd, Evangeline felt utterly alone. At the entrance to the chapel, her uncle Reginald was waiting to escort her down the aisle. As her father's brother and the current Earl of Ashford, he had assumed the responsibility for giving her away. He was a kind man, though somewhat stiff in manner, and he smiled warmly as she approached. "You look magnificent, my dear niece," he said, offering his arm. "Your father would have been so proud." The words struck her heart like a physical blow. If her father were still alive, would he have insisted on this marriage? Or might his love for her have allowed him to consider her happiness alongside duty? She would never know, and that uncertainty added another layer of sorrow to an already heavy heart. The chapel doors opened, and the processional music began. The ancient stone building was packed with guests, their faces turning toward her with expressions of approval and anticipation. Flowers adorned every surface, white roses, lilies, and gardenias that filled the air with their heady perfume. And there, at the altar, stood the Duke of Ravenshollow. He was magnificently dressed in a dark blue coat with gold buttons, cream-colored waistcoat, and perfectly pressed trousers. His cravat was tied with mathematical precision, and his dark hair gleamed in the candlelight. He was the picture of aristocratic elegance, a man born to command and rule. Yet as Evangeline began her slow progress down the aisle, she noticed something that made her footsteps falter. The Duke's attention was not focused on her, his bride. Instead, his gray eyes were fixed on someone else entirely. Following his gaze, Evangeline saw that he was looking at her mother. Victoria had taken her place in the front pew, and the expression on her face was one of such profound emotion that it took Evangeline's breath away. Her mother looked as if she were watching her own execution rather than her daughter's wedding. And the Duke was looking at Victoria with an intensity that spoke of feelings far deeper than mere family friendship. The realization struck Evangeline with the force of lightning. Her mother and her intended husband were in love with each other. Had been, perhaps, for years. And she was merely the instrument of fate that kept them apart, the dutiful daughter fulfilling a promise that would forever prevent their happiness. The rest of the processional passed in a haze. Evangeline moved forward on unsteady legs, her mind reeling with this revelation. How long had they been concealing their feelings? How had she failed to notice the undercurrent of emotion that must have been present during the Duke's visits to Ashford Hall? She reached the altar, and Uncle Reginald placed her hand in the Duke's. His fingers were cold, and she could feel them trembling slightly. When she looked up into his face, she saw the torment in his eyes, the struggle between duty and desire that was tearing him apart. The vicar began the ceremony, his voice echoing in the stone chapel as he spoke the ancient words that would bind them together. But Evangeline barely heard him. She was watching the Duke's face, seeing the way his jaw tightened when the vicar spoke of love and devotion, the way his eyes kept drifting toward her mother. And Victoria, her mother sat frozen in the pew, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. She was trying to maintain her composure, but Evangeline could see the tears threatening to spill over. The vicar reached the crucial moment. If any person can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The chapel fell silent except for the sound of breathing and the rustle of silk gowns. Evangeline felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited, hoping, perhaps, that someone would find the courage to speak the truth. But the silence stretched on, and the vicar was preparing to continue when the Duke suddenly stepped back. "Stop," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel. A gasp ran through the congregation like wind through wheat. The vicar looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Uncle Reginald stepped forward, his face dark with alarm. "Your Grace?" the vicar managed to stammer. The Duke released Evangeline's hands and turned to face the assembled guests. His face was pale but resolute, and when he spoke, his voice was steady despite the chaos he was about to unleash. "I cannot proceed with this ceremony," he announced. "I have deceived you all, and I have deceived myself. I cannot marry Lady Evangeline when my heart belongs to another." The chapel erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps of outrage. Ladies reached for their smelling salts, while gentlemen rose from their seats in indignation. Uncle Reginald looked as if he might suffer an apoplectic fit. But Evangeline felt only a strange sense of relief, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The truth was finally spoken, and though it would scandalize society, it felt like deliverance. The Duke turned toward the front pew, his eyes finding Victoria among the sea of shocked faces. She had gone white as her daughter's wedding gown, one hand pressed to her throat as if she could barely breathe. "Lady Victoria," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence, "I have loved you since we were young, before duty and circumstance separated us. I have tried to honor the promise made by our fathers, but I cannot live a lie. I cannot bind your daughter to a marriage where she will never have my whole heart, because that heart belongs to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria slowly rose from her seat, her movements graceful despite her obvious distress. Every eye in the chapel was fixed upon her as she stepped into the aisle. "Sebastian," she whispered, and in that single word was a lifetime of suppressed longing. The scandal would be tremendous, a duke abandoning his promised bride at the altar for her widowed mother. Society would never forgive such a breach of propriety. Yet as Evangeline watched her mother and the duke look at each other with naked love in their eyes, she felt something she had never expected to feel on her wedding day: joy. Uncle Reginald sputtered forward, his face purple with outrage. "This is unconscionable. The contract, the family's honor." "Uncle," Evangeline said quietly, but her voice carried in the shocked silence. She stepped between him and the duke, surprising herself with her own calm. "Let them be." "Evangeline," her uncle protested, "you cannot possibly understand the implications." "I understand perfectly," she replied, turning to look at her mother and the duke. "I understand that love is worth more than duty, and that a marriage without love is no marriage at all. I will not be the chain that binds two hearts that belong together." Victoria was weeping openly now, but her tears were not of sorrow. The duke stepped down from the altar and walked toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. When he reached her, he took her hands in his, oblivious to the scandalized gasps from the congregation. "Victoria," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I should have spoken years ago. I should have had the courage to break the engagement when your husband died. But I was a coward, bound by duty and fear of society's judgment. Can you forgive me?" "There is nothing to forgive," she replied, her voice trembling. "I was equally cowardly. I should have told you how I felt, should have refused to let you sacrifice yourself for a promise made when we were children." The chapel was in chaos now. Guests were rising from their seats, some leaving in outraged indignation, others staying to witness the extraordinary drama unfolding before them. Uncle Reginald was arguing loudly with several other gentlemen about the legal implications of the broken engagement, while ladies fanned themselves and whispered behind their gloves. But in the midst of the turmoil, Evangeline felt a strange peace settling over her. She had dreaded this day for months, fearing the loss of her freedom and identity. Now, through an act of courage she had never expected, she found herself unexpectedly liberated. The Duke turned back to her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something like wonder. "Lady Evangeline, I owe you an apology that words cannot express. I have wronged you terribly." "No, your grace," she replied with a smile that surprised them both with its genuine warmth. "You have freed me. We would have made each other miserable, trapped in a marriage neither of us wanted. You have given us both the chance for happiness." He bowed deeply to her, a gesture of respect that was not lost on the remaining guests. Then he turned back to Victoria, offering her his arm. "Lady Victoria Ashford," he said formally, though his eyes were soft with love, "would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you properly? To win your hand through affection rather than obligation." Victoria's smile was radiant, transforming her face and making her look years younger. "I would be honored, your grace." As they walked down the aisle together, the chapel erupted in fresh murmurs of shock and speculation. Some guests looked appalled, others seemed secretly delighted by the romantic drama. But Evangeline noticed that several of the older ladies were dabbing at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs, perhaps remembering their own lost chances at love. Uncle Reginald approached Evangeline, his face still flushed with indignation. "My dear niece, we must consider how to manage this disaster. The family's reputation." "Will survive," Evangeline interrupted gently. "People will talk for a few months, then find some new scandal to occupy them. But my mother will have happiness, perhaps for the first time in her life. Is that not worth a little gossip?" Her uncle stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You have changed, Evangeline. There is something different about you." She considered this, still standing at the altar in her wedding gown, surrounded by the debris of her carefully planned future. Perhaps I have finally found myself, uncle. I spent so long preparing to be someone else's wife that I forgot I could simply be myself." The vicar, who had been standing in stunned silence throughout the entire proceedings, finally found his voice. "Lady Evangeline, what shall I tell the remaining guests about the circumstances?" "Tell them the truth," she replied with serene confidence. "That love has triumphed over duty, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the freedom to choose their own happiness." As the chapel slowly emptied, Evangeline remained at the altar for a few moments longer, gathering her thoughts. Her life had just taken a dramatic turn that no one could have predicted. The carefully laid plans of two families had been shattered in a single moment of honesty and courage. Yet instead of feeling lost or devastated, she felt strangely exhilarated. For the first time in her 20 years, she was truly free to determine her own path. The prospect was both terrifying and thrilling. Sarah appeared at her side, the faithful maid's face wet with tears. "Miss Evangeline, what shall we do now?" Evangeline looked down at her elaborate wedding gown, then at the empty chapel where she had expected to pledge her life to a man who loved another. Slowly, she began to smile. "Now, Sarah, we begin again." The days following what society quickly dubbed the Ravens Hollow scandal passed in a whirlwind of shocked visitors, hastily cancelled social engagements, and urgent family conferences. Uncle Reginald spent hours closeted with his lawyers, trying to untangle the legal implications of the broken engagement contract. The Duke had already indicated his willingness to pay whatever compensation was deemed appropriate, but the damage to the family's social standing seemed irreparable. Yet Evangeline found herself caring less about society's disapproval with each passing day. The weight of obligation that had pressed upon her for so long was gone, leaving her feeling lighter than air. She spent her time walking the moors, reading voraciously in her father's library, and discovering aspects of herself that had been suppressed by years of careful training in ladylike accomplishments. Her mother had departed for London with the Duke 3 days after the failed wedding, causing another wave of scandal. Proper mourning periods and lengthy engagements were apparently to be abandoned in favor of passion, a choice that both shocked and secretly thrilled the county's social observers. Victoria had been transformed by her newfound happiness. The shadows that had haunted her eyes for years were gone, replaced by a radiance that made her look like a young woman again. Before leaving, she had held Evangeline close, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "My dearest daughter," she had whispered, "how can I ever thank you for your generosity? You have given me a gift beyond price." "You gave me the greater gift, Mamma," Evangeline had replied. "You showed me that love is worth fighting for, even when the cost seems too high." Now, a week after her wedding day, Evangeline sat in the morning room reading Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a book she had discovered hidden behind more respectable volumes in her father's library. The radical ideas within its pages would have shocked her former self, but now they resonated with a truth that she was only beginning to understand. Uncle Reginald entered without ceremony, his face grave. He had aged considerably in the past week, the stress of managing the family crisis taking its toll on his health. "Evangeline, we must discuss your future," he said, settling heavily into the chair across from her. "Several offers have been made for your hand, gentlemen willing to overlook the recent unpleasantness in exchange for a reduced dowry." She set down her book and looked at him with calm eyes. "Have you accepted any of these offers on my behalf, uncle?" "Of course not. But we must be practical. Your reputation has suffered, and at 20 you cannot afford to wait indefinitely for a husband. These gentlemen are willing to be reasonable." "And I am willing to remain unmarried," Evangeline interrupted softly. Uncle Reginald's face went purple. "Unmarried? Don't be ridiculous, child. You cannot live as a spinster. It would be social suicide." "Perhaps. But it would be my choice, not one made for me by others." She rose gracefully from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the moors that had become her refuge. "I have been thinking, uncle, about what I truly want from life. Marriage to a stranger who sees me merely as a means to repair his fortunes holds no appeal." "Then what do you propose to do with yourself?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You have no means of independent support, no skills beyond those of a lady of leisure. You would be entirely dependent on family charity." Evangeline turned back to him with a serene smile. "I have been corresponding with my Aunt Margaret in Edinburgh. She has invited me to come and live with her. She writes that there are opportunities there for ladies who wish to engage in unconventional pursuits." Aunt Margaret was her father's younger sister, who had scandalized the family 20 years earlier by refusing marriage and dedicating herself to charitable work among the poor. She ran a school for disadvantaged children and was rumored to hold radical views about women's education. Margaret is a cautionary tale, not a role model. Uncle Reginald sputtered. "She chose a life of spinsterhood and obscurity." "She chose a life of purpose and independence," Evangeline corrected gently. "And from her letters, she seems far happier than many married ladies of my acquaintance." Her uncle rose from his chair, pacing the room in agitation. "This is madness, Evangeline. The scandal of the broken engagement will fade, but if you disappear to Scotland to live with that radical sister of your father's, you will be completely beyond the pale. No gentleman will ever consider you then." "Good," she replied with a smile that transformed her face. "I find I have no desire to be considered by gentlemen who view me as a commodity to be acquired." The sound of carriage wheels on gravel interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Evangeline could see an elegant coach approaching the house, one she recognized with a mixture of surprise and pleasure. "We have visitors," she announced, smoothing her skirts. "And unless I am mistaken, it is my mother returning." Uncle Reginald hurried to join her at the window, his expression shifting to one of deep disapproval. With him, no doubt. The impropriety of it all, a widow gallivanting about London with a man to whom she is not yet married. But Evangeline was delighted to see her mother looking so happy. Victoria descended from the carriage with the Duke's assistance, her face glowing with contentment. She was dressed in a traveling costume of deep blue silk that complemented her dark hair and eyes, and she carried herself with a confidence that Evangeline had never seen before. The Duke looked equally transformed. Gone was the rigid, duty-bound aristocrat who had stood at the altar a week ago. In his place was a man clearly in love, his stern features softened by happiness and his grey eyes warm with affection as he looked at Victoria. They were ushered into the drawing-room, where Uncle Reginald greeted them with stiff formality while Evangeline embraced her mother with genuine joy. "Darling, you look wonderful," Victoria exclaimed, holding her daughter at arm's length to study her face. "There is something different about you, a kind of peace I have never seen before." "I could say the same of you, Mamma. Love becomes you." The Duke stepped forward, bowing formally to Evangeline. "Lady Evangeline, I hope you can forgive the irregularity of our visit. We have news that we felt should be shared with you immediately." "Irregularity seems to be the theme of our recent acquaintance, Your Grace," she replied with a smile that drew an answering grin from him. "Please tell me your news." Victoria reached for the Duke's hand, her eyes shining with happiness. "We were married this morning, dearest, by special license, at St. George's, Hanover Square." The announcement fell into the room like a stone into still water. Uncle Reginald's face went through several alarming color changes before settling on a shade of purple that suggested apoplexy. But Evangeline felt only joy for the couple's courage in choosing love over convention. "How wonderful!" she exclaimed, embracing her mother again. "I am so happy for you both." "You are not shocked? Distressed by our haste?" Victoria asked anxiously. "Distressed? Mamma, you have waited years to be happy. Why should you wait any longer?" Evangeline turned to the Duke and curtsied formally. "Congratulations, Your Grace." You have married a remarkable woman. I am well aware of my good fortune, he replied seriously, and I am eternally grateful for your generosity in releasing me from our engagement. Without your understanding, we could never have found this happiness. Uncle Reginald finally found his voice. This is a disaster. The scandal will be enormous, a duke marrying his former fiancée's mother. Society will never recover from the shock. Society will adapt as it always does, the duke replied calmly, and those who cannot accept our happiness are not worthy of our concern. Victoria moved to sit beside her daughter on the settee, taking her hands in her own. Evangeline, dearest, we have been discussing your future. Sebastian and I both feel responsible for the disruption to your life, and we want to do everything possible to help you find happiness. You have already done that, Mama, simply by showing me that happiness is worth fighting for. But practically speaking, the Duke interjected, we want to ensure your financial independence. I have established a trust that will provide you with a comfortable income for life, not as compensation for the broken engagement, but as a wedding gift from your mother and stepfather. The word stepfather hung in the air, strange and wonderful. Evangeline had gained not only her freedom but also a family member who clearly cared for her well-being. That is incredibly generous, but I cannot accept. You can and you will, Victoria interrupted firmly. It is settled. You will have the means to live independently, to choose your own path without being constrained by financial necessity. Uncle Reginald cleared his throat loudly. If I may interrupt this touching scene, there are still practical matters to consider. Evangeline has been contemplating a removal to Scotland, to live with her radical aunt. Such a course would be social ruin. The Duke and Victoria exchanged a look that spoke of deep understanding and shared purpose. On the contrary, the Duke said thoughtfully, I believe Lady Evangeline's instincts are excellent. I have heard good things about Lady Margaret's work in Edinburgh. Such an environment would provide opportunities for intellectual and personal growth that might not be available elsewhere. You approve of my plan? Evangeline asked, surprised by his support. I approve of any plan that allows you to discover who you are meant to be, free from the constraints that have bound you for so long. You have given us the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to love freely. The least we can do is ensure that you have the same opportunity. Victoria squeezed her daughter's hands tightly. Whatever you choose, dearest, we will support you completely. If you wish to go to Edinburgh, we will help you establish yourself there. If you prefer to remain in England, you are welcome to make your home with us. The choice is entirely yours. For the first time in her life, Evangeline was truly free to choose her own destiny. The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying, but she felt ready to embrace whatever adventures awaited her. I think, she said slowly, that I would like to go to Edinburgh. Aunt Margaret's letters speak of work that has real meaning, of the satisfaction that comes from helping others. I have spent my entire life being ornamental. I would like to try being useful instead. Uncle Reginald made a sound of protest, but he was overruled by the warm approval of the newlyweds. Then it is settled, Victoria announced. We will write to Margaret immediately to arrange your journey. As the afternoon progressed, they discussed practical arrangements for Evangeline's new life. The Duke proved to be remarkably knowledgeable about educational opportunities for women, and Victoria had already begun making inquiries about charitable organizations that might benefit from Evangeline's assistance. It was decided that Evangeline would travel to Edinburgh within the month, accompanied by Sarah, who had declared her intention to follow her mistress wherever she might go. The Duke's trust would provide more than adequate funds for a comfortable establishment, and Aunt Margaret had assured them that she would be delighted to introduce her niece to Edinburgh's progressive social circles. As evening fell and the newlyweds prepared to depart for their wedding trip to the continent, Victoria drew her daughter aside for a private moment. Are you truly happy with this arrangement, dearest? I worry that you are sacrificing your own chances for conventional happiness out of some misguided sense of duty to my welfare." Evangeline smiled, the expression transforming her face with its genuine warmth. "Mamma, for the first time in my life, I feel as though I am living rather than merely existing. You and His Grace have given me something more valuable than any marriage could have, the freedom to discover who I am meant to be. And if you find that you miss society, if you decide you want marriage and children after all, then I will be free to choose that path as well. But it will be my choice, made because it brings me joy rather than because it fulfills others' expectations." Victoria embraced her daughter tightly, tears of pride and love streaming down her face. "You have become a remarkable woman, Evangeline. Stronger and wiser than I ever was at your age. I learned from your example, Mamma. You taught me that love requires courage, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the freedom to be themselves." The Duke appeared in the doorway, his expression gentle as he observed the farewell between mother and daughter. "I do not wish to interrupt, but our ship sails with the morning tide. We should depart soon if we are to reach London tonight." As the couple prepared to leave, Evangeline felt a profound sense of completion. The life that had been planned for her was over, but a new life, one of her own choosing, was about to begin. Standing on the front steps of Ashford Hall, she watched the carriage disappear into the gathering dusk. Tomorrow she would begin preparations for her journey to Edinburgh. She would pack away her elaborate gowns and jewels, keeping only what was practical for her new life. The Ashford diamonds would remain in the family vault, waiting for some future bride who might need their weight and grandeur. But tonight she was content to stand in the cool evening air, feeling the mist from the moor's brush against her skin and listening to the sound of her own heart beating with anticipation for the future. A month later, Evangeline stood on the deck of the ship carrying her north to Scotland, watching the English coastline fade into memory. The salty wind whipped at her simple travelling dress, a far cry from the elaborate gowns she had once worn, and her hair, no longer confined by the rigid styles demanded of society ladies, flew freely about her shoulders. Sarah stood beside her, clutching the rail with white knuckles. The faithful maid had never been on a ship before, and her face was distinctly green from the rolling motion of the waves. "Are you quite certain about this course, Miss Evangeline?" Sarah asked for perhaps the 100th time since they had left Ashford Hall. "Scotland is so very far from everything we know." "That is precisely why I chose it," Evangeline replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon ahead. "I want to be far from everything I was expected to be, so I can discover what I actually am." The journey to Edinburgh took 2 days, and with each mile that passed, Evangeline felt herself changing. The rigid posture drilled into her by years of deportment lessons relaxed into something more natural. She found herself speaking to fellow passengers, merchants, clerks, even working-class families. Conversations that would have been unthinkable in her former life, but that opened her eyes to worlds beyond the narrow confines of aristocratic society. When they finally arrived at Edinburgh's port of Leith, Evangeline barely recognized herself in the ship's mirror. Her cheeks were flushed with sea air, her eyes bright with excitement, and her smile was genuine rather than the carefully practiced expression she had once worn like a mask. Aunt Margaret was waiting for them at the dock, and Evangeline would have known her anywhere despite the years since their last meeting. Lady Margaret Ashford was a tall, angular woman of 53, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple knot and intelligent gray eyes that seemed to see everything. She was dressed in practical woolen garments that spoke of active work rather than fashionable display, and her hands were ink-stained from her correspondence with various charitable organizations. "Evangeline, my dear girl!" she exclaimed, embracing her niece warmly. "How wonderful you look, and how different from your portraits! There is life in your face now, real life. Thank you for welcoming me, Aunt Margaret. I hope I will not be too much of a burden." Margaret laughed, a rich sound that spoke of genuine joy. "A burden? My dear, you are an answer to prayer. I have been hoping for years that some member of our family would show the good sense to escape the suffocating conventions of English society. Come, let us collect your things and get you settled. I am eager to show you what real life looks like." The carriage ride through Edinburgh was a revelation. The city was alive with energy and purpose in a way that London's fashionable districts never were. Students from the university mingled with merchants and craftsmen, while women of various social classes moved purposefully through the streets on errands that seemed to have genuine importance. There was an intellectual vitality in the air that made Evangeline's pulse quicken with anticipation. Margaret's home was a substantial but unpretentious house in the new town, furnished with books, maps, and the practical tools of her various charitable endeavors. There were no gilt mirrors or silk wallpapers, but the rooms radiated warmth and purpose in a way that Ashford Hall's grandest chambers never had. "I have prepared the blue bedroom for you," Margaret said as they climbed the stairs. "It has excellent light for reading, and a view of the garden where I grow herbs for the hospital. Sarah can have the adjoining chamber, though I should warn you that we live quite simply here. No ladies' maids in the traditional sense, we all help with the daily work." Sarah looked somewhat alarmed at this prospect, but Evangeline found it refreshing. "I should like to learn to be useful with my hands, Aunt. I have spent my entire life being waited upon, and I find I am curious about practical skills." "Excellent. Tomorrow I will introduce you to Mrs. MacLeod, who runs our school for working-class children. She can teach you more about the satisfaction of real work than years of embroidery and watercolor painting ever could." That evening, over a simple but delicious dinner prepared by Margaret's single servant, they discussed Evangeline's plans for her new life. Margaret's enthusiasm was infectious as she described the various projects she supported: schools for the poor, medical clinics for factory workers, and even a nascent women's rights organization that met monthly to discuss legal reforms. "The law is beginning to change," Margaret explained, her eyes bright with passion. "Slowly, yes, but there are those in Parliament who recognize that women's capabilities extend beyond the drawing-room. Here in Scotland, we have always been somewhat more progressive than our English cousins." "What could I do to help?" Evangeline asked. "I have no practical skills, no training beyond the accomplishments deemed suitable for a lady. You have intelligence, compassion, and most importantly, you have resources. The Duke's Trust will provide you with independence, but it also places you in a position to help others. Money, wisely used, can accomplish remarkable things." Over the following weeks, Evangeline threw herself into learning about her new world with the same dedication she had once applied to perfecting her French and piano playing. She visited the schools where Margaret worked, observing how dedicated teachers transformed the lives of children who might otherwise have remained trapped in poverty. She toured the medical clinics, seeing how proper health care could restore hope to families devastated by industrial accidents or disease. Most surprisingly, she discovered a natural talent for organization and administration. The methodical mind that had once been applied to planning elaborate dinner parties proved invaluable in coordinating charitable efforts and managing the complex logistics of educational programs. "You have found your calling," Margaret observed one evening as they reviewed the accounts for the children's school. "I have never seen anyone master the details of charitable administration so quickly." "I find it deeply satisfying," Evangeline admitted. "Every pound properly allocated, every program successfully implemented, it all has real meaning. People's lives are genuinely improved by the work we do." She had been in Edinburgh for 3 months when a letter arrived that would change her life once again. It bore the Duke of Ravensshallow's seal, and her heart fluttered with nervousness as she broke it open. The letter was from her mother, written in Victoria's familiar flowing script. "My dearest Evangeline, I hope this letter finds you well and happy in your new life. Sebastian and I have just returned from our wedding trip, and we are both eager for news of your adventures in Scotland. We have settled at Ravenshollow Castle for the present, though we plan to divide our time between Sebastian's various properties. The countryside here is beautiful, and I find great contentment in managing the domestic affairs of such a grand estate. Who would have thought that your practical mother would prove adept at directing a household of 60 servants? But I write with news that I hope will bring you joy. We are expecting a child. The physicians believe the baby will arrive in early spring, and Sebastian is beside himself with delight at the prospect of becoming a father. At 43, I had thought such happiness was beyond my reach, but love, it seems, has its own timing. I know that society will have much to say about a woman of my age bearing a child, particularly one conceived so soon after marriage to her daughter's former fiancé. But I find I care less for society's opinions with each passing day. Happiness is too precious to be sacrificed to convention. How are you faring in your new life? Margaret's letters speak of your remarkable adaptation to charitable work, and she seems convinced that you have discovered your true calling. I confess myself curious about this transformation. When you left us, you were still very much the proper young lady we had raised you to be. Margaret's descriptions suggest someone quite different has emerged. Sebastian sends his warmest regards and asks me to tell you that he considers himself the most fortunate of men to have gained both a beloved wife and such a remarkable stepdaughter. The trust he established for you continues to perform well, and should you need additional funds for any of your charitable endeavors, you have only to write to his man of business. Please give our love to Margaret, and know that you are missed and thought of daily. Your loving mother, Victoria, Duchess of Ravens Hollow. Evangeline read the letter twice, her emotions swirling between joy for her mother's happiness and amazement at how completely their lives had changed. A baby. Her mother was to have a child with a man who had been intended as Evangeline's own husband. The scandal would be enormous, but as Victoria had written, happiness was too precious to sacrifice to convention. Good news? Margaret asked, looking up from her own correspondence. The best possible news, Evangeline replied, handing over the letter. My mother is with child, and radiantly happy. Margaret read the letter with growing delight, her eyes twinkling with amusement. A baby! How perfectly wonderful, and how perfectly scandalous! Your mother has certainly made up for lost time in embracing an unconventional life. I find I am genuinely delighted for them, Evangeline mused. 6 months ago, I would have been horrified by the impropriety of it all. Now I simply feel joy that they have found such happiness together. You have changed, my dear, Margaret observed. When you first arrived, you still carried yourself like a lady in exile, as if you were merely visiting this life rather than living it. Now you seem truly at home in your own skin. It was true. Evangeline could feel the difference in herself, in the way she moved, spoke, and thought about the world around her. The rigid constraints that had once defined her existence had fallen away, replaced by a sense of purpose and authenticity that was entirely new. Her reflection was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Margaret's servant, Mrs. Sinclair, appeared a moment later with a calling card. "A gentleman to see Miss Evangeline," she announced. "A Mr. James Morrison says he's a friend of Lady Margaret's from the university." Margaret's eyebrows rose with surprise and what might have been pleased speculation. "James Morrison? Show him in immediately, Mrs. Sinclair. This is an unexpected pleasure." A few moments later, a tall, dark-haired man entered the drawing-room. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with the kind of lean, intelligent face that spoke of serious scholarship and deep thinking. His clothes were well-made but not fashionable, suggesting a man who cared more for substance than appearance. When he smiled, his entire face transformed with warmth and genuine pleasure. "Lady Margaret," he said, bowing over her hand. "How delightful to see you again. I hope you will forgive the intrusion, but I have just returned from London and heard the most interesting rumors about your distinguished house-guest. James, may I present my niece, Miss Evangeline Ashford. Evangeline, this is Mr. James Morrison, Professor of Philosophy at the University and one of Scotland's most progressive thinkers." Evangeline rose and curtsied, studying the man with frank curiosity. There was something about him that was immediately appealing, an air of intellectual vitality and genuine kindness that was entirely different from the calculated charm of the society gentleman she had once known. "Miss Ashford," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a directness that was both surprising and refreshing, "I must confess I have been eager to meet the young lady who has caused such a stir in London society. The story of your wedding day has reached even our remote academic circles." "I hope the version you heard was not too unflattering," Evangeline replied with a smile. "On the contrary, the tale as I heard it spoke of remarkable courage and generosity. Not many young ladies would have the strength to sacrifice their own security for another's happiness." "I sacrificed nothing, Mr. Morrison. I gained my freedom." His eyes lit up with interest and approval. "Spoken like a true philosopher. Lady Margaret tells me you have thrown yourself into charitable work with remarkable success." "I have found it far more satisfying than accomplishments I was previously taught to value." "Perhaps you would be interested in visiting the university? We have recently established a program of public lectures on social reform that might interest someone of your progressive inclinations." The invitation was clearly more than casual politeness, and Evangeline felt a flutter of something she had never experienced before, genuine intellectual attraction to a man who saw her as more than a decorative object. "I should be delighted," she replied. "When is the next lecture?" "Tomorrow evening, as it happens. I am delivering a paper on women's education and social progress that has generated considerable controversy among my more traditional colleagues." Margaret clapped her hands together with delight. "Perfect. Evangeline, you must attend. James's lectures are always fascinating, and this topic is particularly relevant to your interests." As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself drawn into the most stimulating conversation of her life. Mr. Morrison, James, as he insisted she call him, had traveled extensively, read voraciously, and thought deeply about questions that had never been considered suitable topics for drawing-room discussion. He spoke of social justice, educational reform, and the changing role of women in society with the kind of passion she had once reserved for discussions of her mother's happiness. Even more remarkably, he listened to her opinions with genuine attention and respect. When she described her work with the children's school, he asked thoughtful questions that showed he valued her insights. When she mentioned her interest in legal reforms affecting women's property rights, he engaged with her ideas as if they came from an equal rather than a decorative companion. "You have a natural understanding of social dynamics," he told her as the evening drew to a close. "Have you considered writing about your observations? There are journals that would be very interested in perspectives from someone with your unique background and experiences." Writing! The idea had never occurred to her. "I am not certain I have anything worthwhile to say." "I disagree completely. You have lived on both sides of the social divide. You understand privilege from the inside and service from practical experience. That combination of perspectives is extraordinarily rare and valuable." After he left, Margaret regarded her niece with knowing eyes. "Well, that was interesting." "He seems very passionate about his work," Evangeline said carefully, aware that her cheeks were warmer than the fire in the grate could account for. "James is one of the finest men I know," Margaret said seriously. "Brilliant, principled, and utterly without pretension. He comes from a merchant family in Glasgow. His father made a fortune in shipping, but he chose scholarship over commerce. The university is fortunate to have him. He seems quite different from the gentleman I knew in England." "In every possible way," Margaret agreed with a smile. "James values intellectual companionship over social connections, substance over style. He has been married to his books and his causes for so long that many of us had given up hope of his ever finding a woman who could capture his attention." "Aunt Margaret!" "I merely observe, my dear. But I will say this. I have never seen James show such immediate interest in anyone. Usually, he needs to know someone for months before he becomes truly engaged in conversation with them. That night, Evangeline lay awake thinking about the evening's conversation and the unexpected feelings it had stirred. For the first time since arriving in Edinburgh, she found herself thinking about the possibility of marriage, not as a duty or social necessity, but as a partnership with someone who understood and valued her mind as well as her person. The following evening, she attended James's lecture with nervous anticipation. The university's lecture hall was packed with an audience that included professors, students, clergy, and a surprising number of fashionably dressed ladies. The topic of women's education was clearly controversial enough to draw spectators from across Edinburgh's social spectrum. James took the podium with quiet confidence, his presentation both scholarly and passionate. He argued eloquently for women's right to higher education, citing examples from classical antiquity as well as contemporary social conditions. His statistics on literacy rates among working women were particularly compelling, and his vision of an educated female citizenry was both radical and inspiring. But what impressed Evangeline most was his genuine respect for women's intellectual capabilities. He spoke not of educating women to be better wives and mothers, the usual justification offered for female learning, but of developing their minds for their own sake and for the betterment of society as a whole. During the question period that followed, several gentlemen in the audience challenged his premises with arguments that ranged from theological to medical. James responded to each objection with patience and scholarly rigor, never condescending but never compromising his principles. When one particularly pompous critic suggested that educated women would abandon their natural roles and create social chaos, James replied with a smile that transformed his serious face. "Sir, I would argue that the greatest social chaos comes from wasted human potential. When we deny half our population the opportunity to contribute their full capabilities to society, we impoverish ourselves immeasurably. The question is not whether women can learn. Any honest observer knows they can, but whether we are wise enough to allow them to do so." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Evangeline found herself clapping enthusiastically along with the rest of the audience. She had never heard anyone articulate so clearly the ideas that had been growing in her own mind over the past months. After the lecture, James sought her out among the crowd of well-wishers and critics who surrounded him. "Miss Ashford, what did you think of the presentation?" he asked, his eyes bright with the excitement of intellectual engagement. "I thought it was magnificent," she replied honestly. "You made me realize that my own education was designed to limit rather than develop my capabilities. I was taught to be ornamental rather than useful. And yet you have managed to become extraordinarily useful despite those limitations. Imagine what you might accomplish with proper intellectual training to supplement your natural abilities." The suggestion took her breath away. "Are you suggesting that I might attend lectures? Pursue formal education?" "Why not? The university does not yet admit women as degree candidates, but there are informal arrangements for serious students. Several ladies currently audit classes in philosophy and literature. If you are interested, I would be happy to introduce you to the relevant professors." The possibility opened up before her like a door into a new world. To study philosophy, history, perhaps even political economy, subjects that had been forbidden to her as a lady but that now seemed essential to her development as a thinking person. "I should like that very much," she said, her voice barely steady with excitement. "Excellent. Shall we begin with philosophy? I am teaching a seminar on social contract theory next month that I think would particularly interest someone with your background and concerns." As they walked from the lecture hall together, Evangeline felt the same sense of possibility that had filled her on the morning she chose to set her mother and the Duke free. Once again, she was stepping into unknown territory, but this time she was not fleeing duty, she was embracing opportunity. The months that followed were among the happiest of Evangeline's life. She threw herself into her studies with the same dedication she had once applied to perfecting her needlework, but with immeasurably greater satisfaction. James proved to be an inspiring teacher, challenging her assumptions and encouraging her to think critically about everything from political theory to moral philosophy. Even more importantly, she found in him a true intellectual companion. Their conversations ranged across literature, politics, social reform, and the great questions of human existence. He never patronized her or dismissed her ideas because of her sex, but engaged with her thoughts as seriously as he would those of any male colleague. Their relationship deepened gradually, built on mutual respect and shared passion for learning and social justice. When James finally declared his feelings, it came not as a dramatic romantic gesture but as a natural expression of intellectual and emotional partnership. "Evangeline," he said one evening as they walked through Edinburgh's Royal Mile after attending a lecture on prison reform, "I find that I cannot imagine my future without you in it. Not merely as a companion or helpmate, but as a true partner in all aspects of life." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her heart racing with joy and anticipation. "James, I feel the same way. I had begun to think that marriage was incompatible with the life I wanted to live, but with you. With me, you would never have to choose between marriage and intellectual growth. I want a wife who challenges me, who pursues her own interests and causes, who remains fully herself within our partnership." It was everything she had never known she wanted. Love combined with respect, passion balanced with partnership, romance grounded in genuine compatibility of minds and values. They married 6 months later in a simple ceremony at St. Giles Cathedral, witnessed by Margaret and a small gathering of friends from the university and charitable organizations. Evangeline wore a dress of ivory silk far simpler than her original wedding gown, but infinitely more beautiful because it represented her own choice rather than others' expectations. Victoria and the Duke traveled from England for the ceremony, bringing with them Evangeline's baby half-brother, a robust infant named Charles who had Victoria's dark eyes and his father's determined chin. The reunion between mother and daughter was emotional and joyful, both women marveling at the paths their lives had taken since that dramatic morning at Ashford Hall. "You have found exactly the life you were meant to live," Victoria told her daughter as they sat in Margaret's garden after the ceremony, little Charles sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. "As have you, Mamma. Are you happy?" "Happier than I ever thought possible," Victoria replied with a radiant smile. "Sebastian is the most wonderful husband and father, and little Charles has brought such joy to our lives. Who would have thought that a broken engagement could lead to such complete happiness for all of us?" The Duke, overhearing, approached with James and Uncle Reginald, who had grudgingly attended the wedding despite his disapproval of the entire family's unconventional choices. "I must thank you again, Evangeline," the Duke said seriously. "Your courage on our original wedding day made all of our current happiness possible. I hope you know how grateful we will always be." "There is nothing to thank me for," she replied, taking James's hand. "I simply chose honesty over convention, and it freed all of us to find our true paths." Uncle Reginald, who had been unusually quiet throughout the day's festivities, finally spoke. "I must admit, Evangeline, that I was wrong about your choices. I feared you would ruin yourself by rejecting society's expectations, but I see now that you have found something far more valuable than social approval." "What is that, Uncle?" "Authenticity," he replied simply. "You have become entirely yourself, and it suits you remarkably well." As the sun set over Edinburgh that evening, Evangeline reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been preparing for a marriage that would have denied her true nature and trapped her in a life of beautiful emptiness. Now she was married to a man who valued her mind as much as her heart, pursuing studies that challenged and fulfilled her, and working for causes that gave her life genuine meaning. The scandal of her broken engagement had faded into memory, replaced by new gossip and fresh controversies. Society had moved on, as it always did, and those who had once whispered about the Duke's shocking choice now spoke admiringly of the love match he had made and the brilliant scholar his former fiancée had married. But most importantly, Evangeline had discovered that happiness was not something to be granted by others or achieved through conformity to expectations. It was something to be claimed through courage, nurtured through authenticity, and shared with those who valued truth over convention. As she stood at the window of her new home, Watching the lights of Edinburgh twinkle in the gathering dusk, she thought of all the young women still trapped in the golden cages of society's expectations. Perhaps, through her writing and her example, she could help them see that another path was possible. That love and learning, purpose and passion, could all be theirs if they had the courage to choose freedom over security. The future stretched ahead of her, filled with possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. There would be books to read, articles to write, students to teach, and causes to champion. There would be a partnership with James built on mutual respect and shared dreams, and perhaps, someday, children to raise with the freedom to become whoever they were meant to be. But tonight she was simply content to be herself, no longer the Earl of Ashford's dutiful daughter or the Duke of Ravensshallow's promised bride, but Evangeline Morrison, scholar, writer, reformer, and woman. She had found her voice, claimed her life, and discovered that the greatest romance of all was the love affair between a person and their own authentic existence. The mist was rising from the Edinburgh streets, soft and mysterious in the lamplight, carrying with it the promise of new adventures and undiscovered truths. Evangeline smiled and closed the window, turning back to the warm light of her home and the man who waited for her there, ready to share whatever tomorrow might bring. In choosing freedom, she had found everything she had never known she wanted. And that, she thought, was the most beautiful ending of all.